The complete story. The asphalt of Highway 9 shimmered in the brutal Arizona heat waves of scorching air rising off the blacktop like ghosts trying to escape hell. The temperature gauge at the Texaco station 3 miles back had read 107 degrees, but out here on the open stretch between Ridgemont and the county line, it felt closer to 120. The kind of heat that baked the moisture out of everything it touched, leaving behind only dust and desperation. Marin Cole sat on the concrete curb outside the highway diner, her knees pulled tight against her chest, making herself as small as possible. She was 9 years old, though she looked younger. Malnutrition and chronic stress had stunted her growth, leaving her skinny and frail with arms like twigs and a hollow look in her eyes that no child should ever carry. Her dirty blonde hair hung in tangles around her face unwashed for 3 days because the water had been shut off at their apartment again. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was the bruise. The left side of Marin's face was a violent canvas of purple and black, swollen so badly that her eye had nearly disappeared into the puffy, discolored flesh. The bruise spread from her temple down to her cheekbone, a perfect handprint frozen in time documenting the exact moment 3 nights ago when Vince Keller's open palm had connected with her face hard enough to knock her into the kitchen counter. Marin traced the edge of the bruise with trembling fingers, wincing at the tenderness. The pain was constant, a throbbing reminder that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. She had learned not to cry about it anymore. Tears didn't help. Tears just made things worse. Through the smudged window of the diner, she could see her mother Claire moving between the tables, her face locked in the exhausted half-smile that waitresses wear like armor. Claire was on her second consecutive shift, 14 hours on her feet, with only one 15-minute break to wolf down a stale turkey sandwich in the back by the dumpsters. Her ankles were swollen, her lower back screaming, but she kept moving because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant breaking down. Claire Bennett had been Claire Cole once, back when she still believed in things like love and happy endings. That was before Daniel Cole Marin's father had walked out the door when their daughter was 3 years old, taking nothing but the clothes on his back and leaving behind only a single dog tag on a chain and a silence so complete it felt like death. Marin pulled that dog tag out from under her faded t-shirt, now holding it up to catch the light. The metal was warm from resting against her skin all day. Engraved on one side, Cole Daniel J., on the other his service number and blood type. Her father had been a Marine, though Marin had no memory of him. Just this piece of stamped metal and 1,000 unanswered questions. She squeezed the dog tag tight in her fist, the edges biting into her palm. Somewhere out there, her real father was alive. She was sure of it. He had to be. And maybe if she wished hard enough, he would come back. He would walk through that door, scoop her up in his arms, and take her away from all of this. But Daniel Cole never came. And in his absence, monsters had moved in to fill the void. Vince Keller was the latest monster. He was a welder by trade when he bothered to work, which wasn't often. Mostly he was a drunk and a bully, the kind of man who compensated for his own failures by making everyone around him feel smaller. He had started dating Claire about 8 months ago, all charm and promises at first, but the mask had slipped quickly. 3 nights ago, Vince had shown up at their apartment at midnight, pounding on the door and demanding money. Claire had just gotten her tips from the diner, $63 in crumpled bills and loose change meant to cover groceries and the overdue electric bill. Vince wanted it for the poker game running at Shooter's Bar. Claire had said no. That was her mistake. Marin could still hear the sound of her mother's head hitting the doorframe, the sick thud of flesh on wood. She had run from her bedroom, throwing herself between Vince and her mother, screaming at him to stop. For a moment, Vince had frozen, startled by the tiny girl's fury. Then he had smiled slow and mean. You got your mama's mouth, little girl. Let me teach you what happens when you talk back. The slap had come so fast, Marin hadn't even seen it. 1 second she was standing, the next she was on the floor, her face exploding in pain, the taste of copper flooding her mouth. Vince had taken the money from Claire's purse, kicked over the coffee table on his way out, and left them both crying in the wreckage of their living room. Claire had held ice to Marin's face until dawn, whispering apologies over and over like a prayer. I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. I'll keep you safe. I promise I'll keep you safe. But Claire couldn't keep her safe. Not really, not from Vince, and definitely not from what was waiting for Marin tomorrow at school. Marin shifted on the hot concrete, trying to find a position that didn't make her bruised ribs ache. Tomorrow was the annual father-daughter field day at Pinewood Elementary School. For the past 3 weeks, it was all anyone could talk about. The three-legged race, the woodworking projects, the barbecue. All the girls would be there with their dads, laughing and playing and making memories. All the girls except Marin. She had tried to pretend it didn't bother her. She had filled out the permission slip with a shrug, left the father's name line blank, and told herself she didn't care. But Dylan Garrett cared. Dylan cared a lot. Dylan Garrett was 12 years old, held back a year, and big for his age, with the kind of casual cruelty that came from never being told no. His father was Marcus Garrett, city councilman, and the most powerful man in Ridgemont. Marcus owned half the businesses in town, sat on every board that mattered, and had the police, the mayor, and the zoning commission in his pocket. Like father, like son, Dylan ruled Pinewood Elementary with an iron fist, flanked by two sycophant followers who laughed at his jokes and backed up his threats. For the past 8 months, Dylan had made Marin's life a living hell, tripping her in the hallway, dumping her lunch in the trash, shoving her into lockers hard enough to leave bruises. But verbal cruelty was Dylan's real specialty. He had an instinct for finding the softest spots and pressing down until something broke. Yesterday, Dylan had cornered Marin by the water fountain. His two friends blocked her escape while Dylan leaned in close, his breath smelling like the Cheetos he'd eaten at lunch. I heard you signed up for Father-Daughter Day Bennett. His smile was all teeth sharp and predatory. That's funny. Really funny. Because last I checked, you don't have a daddy, do you? Marin had stared at the floor, her fists clenched tight at her sides, fighting the urge to cry. Don't give him the satisfaction. Don't let him see. He left because you're ugly and stupid, Dylan continued, his voice loud enough for the other kids to hear. My dad says your mom's a trashy waitress and your family's garbage. That's why your daddy ran away. He couldn't stand looking at you. One of Dylan's friends had laughed, a high, cruel sound that echoed off the cinder block walls. Dylan leaned even closer until his face was inches from Marin's. So here's the deal, Bennett. If you show up tomorrow without a dad, I'm gonna beat the shit out of you, right there in front of everyone. My dad will be there watching and he'll laugh because nobody cares about white trash orphans. Bring a dad tomorrow or I break your other eye. Then he had shoved her hard against the wall and walked away, leaving Marin gasping for breath and blinking back tears. She couldn't tell her mother. Claire was barely holding it together as it was. If she told Claire about Dylan's threat, her mother would either do something reckless that would get them both hurt, or she would dissolve into guilty tears and self-recrimination, and Marin couldn't handle either option right now. She couldn't ask Vince, even if he wasn't a monster, even if he hadn't just given her this black eye. There was no universe in which Vince Keller would willingly spend a Saturday doing three-legged races in woodworking projects. And her real father, Daniel Cole, was gone, just a ghost on a dog tag chain. So tomorrow, Marin would either stay home and confirm everything Dylan said about her being a coward and an orphan, or she would show up alone and get beaten in front of the entire school. Neither option seemed survivable. Marin pulled her knees tighter to her chest and rested her forehead against them, squeezing her eyes shut. The heat of the pavement radiated through her worn jeans. In the distance, she could hear the lonely sound of wind chimes hanging from the diner's porch jangling discordantly in the hot breeze. Then she felt it, a vibration. Low and deep, more sensation than sound traveling up through the concrete and into her bones. Marin lifted her head, blinking against the bright sunlight. At first she thought it was a truck, maybe one of the big rigs that sometimes used Highway 9 as a shortcut. But the sound was different, rougher, more aggressive. A mechanical growl that seemed to be getting louder by the second. She shaded her eyes with one hand and looked down the one empty stretch of highway. The heat waves made everything shimmer and distort, turning the horizon into a liquid mirage. But through that distortion, she saw them. Dark shapes moving in formation, growing larger as they approached. The growl became a roar, became thunder, became a sound so loud and visceral it seemed to shake the air itself. 6 motorcycles. Heavy, powerful machines painted matte black and chrome, their riders sitting tall and rigid in their seats. They weren't casual weekend riders out for a scenic cruise. They moved with military precision, riding 2 abreast in a tight formation that spoke of discipline and brotherhood. As they got closer, Marin could make out more details. The bikes were Harley-Davidsons, customized and well-maintained, with high-rise handlebars and leather saddlebags. The riders wore leather vests over their clothes, dark sunglasses, and heavy boots. Even from a distance, she could see the patches on their backs, though she couldn't make out the details yet. The lead bike signaled, and as one unit, all 6 motorcycles slowed and turned off the highway into the gravel parking lot of the Highway Diner. The noise was apocalyptic, now a symphony of internal combustion that drowned out everything else. Birds scattered from the telephone wires. The wind chimes went silent, as if even they were holding their breath. The motorcycles rolled to a stop in a neat line, their engines rumbling like caged thunder. Then almost simultaneously, the riders killed their engines. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the ticking of hot metal cooling and the crunch of gravel under heavy boots. Marin forgot to breathe. These weren't weekend warriors playing dress-up. Everything about them screamed authenticity, from their weathered leather to the way they moved with casual confidence, born from thousands of miles on the road. Their vests were covered in patches and pins, each one telling a story Marin didn't know how to read. But she could read the main patch on their backs. Now that they had turned to dismount, she could see it clearly. A skull with wings spread wide, rendered in intricate detail. Above it, a rocker that read Hell's Angels. Below it, Arizona. Marin's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew about the Hells Angels. Everyone in Ridgemont knew about them. They had a fortified clubhouse out on the county line surrounded by chain-link fence and barbed wire. People whispered about them in grocery store checkout lines and beauty parlors. Dangerous men, criminals, outlaws who lived by their own code. The police gave them a wide berth. Marcus Garrett called them a menace in his campaign speeches, promised to run them out of town if voters gave him enough power. But so far, the Hells Angels remained a constant presence on the edge of town, neither asking for approval nor seeking conflict. And now 6 of them were standing in the parking lot of the Highway Diner, not 20 feet from where Marin sat. The lead rider dismounted first. He was massive, easily 6'4", with the kind of build that suggested a lifetime of hard physical labor and harder living. His arms were thick as tree trunks, covered entirely in faded tattoos that disappeared under the rolled-up sleeves of his black t-shirt. A jagged scar ran from his left earlobe down the side of his neck to his collarbone, the kind of scar that told stories about bar fights and broken bottles. His beard was thick and streaked with gray, tied off with a leather cord. When he removed his dark sunglasses and hooked them on his vest, Marin saw his eyes. They were a pale, icy blue, the color of Arctic water, and they held an expression of such cold, controlled intensity that she felt pinned in place just looking at him. The name tag stitched onto his leather vest read Hammer. Hammer rolled his massive shoulders, stretching after the long ride, and pulled a pack of Marlboro Reds from his vest pocket. The other 5 bikers fanned out behind him, talking in low, gravelly voices. One of them, a wiry man with a completely bald head covered in tattoos, said something that made the others laugh, a rough, barking sound. Every instinct, Marin had screamed at her to run, to get up, go inside the diner, hide under a table, until these terrifying men finished whatever business they had and left. Her mother had given her very clear instructions about strangers, especially men who looked dangerous. Stay away, don't talk to them, don't make eye contact. Run if you have to. But something else spoke up inside Marin's head. A small, desperate voice that had been growing louder over the past few weeks as Dylan's threats escalated and tomorrow's field day loomed closer. These men aren't afraid of anything. Nobody pushes them around. Nobody hits them. Nobody makes them feel small. And before that thought could fully form into a plan, before the fear could completely paralyze her legs, Marin stood up. Her worn sneakers crunched softly on the gravel as she took one step forward, then another. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat, choking off her air, but she kept walking. Hammer had just struck his Zippo lighter, bringing the flame to the cigarette dangling from his lips when he paused. His pale blue eyes flicked downward. Standing barely at the level of his heavy silver belt buckle was a scrawny kid trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. The child's face was tilted up toward him, one eye wide and brown, the other nearly swollen shut beneath a vicious purple bruise. Hammer exhaled a slow stream of smoke, his gaze narrowing as it locked onto the girl's face. Behind him, the other bikers noticed the interaction and went quiet, turning to see what had caught their leader's attention. They stepped closer, their massive frames casting long shadows over the small girl. For a moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the distant hum of the diner's struggling air conditioner and the lazy buzz of flies circling the dumpster around back. "You lost, kid?" Hammer's voice was like grinding stones, deep and rough from decades of cigarettes and whiskey. Marin swallowed hard. Her throat felt like sandpaper. "No, sir." "Then you're standing awful close to my bike." It wasn't quite a threat, just an observation delivered in that same flat, gravelly tone. One of the other bikers, the bald one, leaned over and muttered something to his companion. Marin caught the words black eye and somebody's problem. Hammer took another drag of his cigarette, his eyes never leaving Marin's face. "You need me to get your mama she inside." This was it. This was the moment. Marin could feel the fear trying to drag her backward, trying to make her apologize and scurry away like a frightened mouse. But if she did that, tomorrow would still come. Dylan would still be waiting, and she would still be alone. Marin took a deep breath, her small fists clenching at her sides. She looked up past the leather vest, past the death's head, patch right into Hammer's cold blue eyes. "I don't need my mom," Marin said, her voice shaking but her gaze unwavering. "I need a dad, just for tomorrow. I need you to be my dad." For a full 5 seconds, the only sound in the sweltering parking lot was the distant clang of dishes from inside the diner and the hiss of steam from an overheated radiator somewhere down the highway. Then one of the bikers behind Hammer, a man who went by the road name Reaper, let out a sharp barking laugh. "Well, I'll be damned, Hammer. Didn't know you had a kid running around Ridgemont." A few chuckles rippled through the group, but Hammer didn't laugh. He didn't even crack a smile. He stood completely still, the cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers, staring down at this tiny battered girl who had just walked up to one of the most dangerous men in Arizona and demanded a father. The laughter died away. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change in their leader's demeanor. Hammer slowly crouched down, his leather pants creaking loudly in the heat until he was eye level with Marin. Up close, he smelled like motor oil, tobacco, and old sweat. The scar on his neck looked even more vicious at this distance, a puckered white line that someone had tried to stitch closed without proper medical equipment. "What's your name, kid?" Hammer asked softly. His voice had lost its hard edge, replaced by something that might have been curiosity or might have been something deeper. Marin Cole." "Well, Marin Cole, I ain't nobody's father." Hammer's tone was flat, but not unkind. "And even if I was, I don't play pretend. Why the hell are you asking me?" Marin felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried enough already. Instead, she pointed to her bruised face with one small finger. "Because of Dylan Garrett and his dad, Mr. Garrett. Tomorrow is Father-Daughter Day at my school. Dylan said if I show up alone because my real dad left, he's going to beat me up again. And Mr. Garrett always watches and laughs." Hammer's brow furrowed deep creases forming in his weathered forehead. "This Garrett kid gave you that shiner." Marin shook her head quickly. "No, Vince did. He's my mom's ex-boyfriend. Sort of. He came by for money 3 nights ago." She looked back up at Hammer, her voice cracking with a mixture of shame and desperate hope. "I just need someone big, someone they'll be scared of. Just for one day, please. I have $14 in my piggy bank. I'll pay you." Hammer stared at the girl in silence. Inside his chest, something long dormant and carefully buried began to stir. A memory from 4 decades ago fighting its way to the surface despite his best efforts to keep it drowned. Nevada, 1984. A trailer park where the dirt was always dusty and the air always smelled like propane and desperation. A scrawny 12-year-old boy named Jackson Miller hiding under the porch while his mother's screams echoed through the paper-thin walls. The sound of bottles breaking, his father's voice slurred and vicious with alcohol and rage. The night Jackson had crept out from under the porch and found his mother on the kitchen floor, her skull cracked open, blood pooling on the yellow linoleum. His father passed out in the recliner, an empty whiskey bottle still clutched in his hand. Jackson had held his mother while she died, her blood soaking into his shirt, her final words barely a whisper. "Run, baby. Don't look back." He had run. 14 years old, alone, terrified, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a rage in his chest that felt big enough to burn the world down. He had learned quickly that the only way to survive monsters was to become a bigger, scarier monster. The Hells Angels had found him when he was 19, half dead from hunger and exposure in Death Valley. An old biker named Bones had pulled over, looked at the feral kid with murder in his eyes and said, "You got nowhere else to go, prospect. Might as well ride with us." 40 years later, that feral kid had become Hammerstone president of the Arizona Charter, one of the most feared men in the Southwest. He had built a life on the principle that weakness got you killed and sentiment got you buried. But looking at Marin Cole, this tiny girl with a black eye and $14, Hammer saw himself, saw the child he had been before the world taught him not to care. Hammer stood up slowly, his knees popping audibly. He turned to look at his brothers, the 5 men who had ridden with him today, who had bled with him, who knew him better than anyone alive. Reaper wasn't laughing anymore. His expression had gone serious, his tattooed arms crossed over his chest. Next to him stood Bear, a 2-meter giant who looked like he could bench press a car, but who Hammer knew cried every time he talked about his 9-year-old daughter Sophie back home. Doc, the quietest of the group, stepped forward. He still wore reading glasses perched on his nose, a reminder of his previous life as a corporate lawyer in Chicago before he traded courtrooms for the open road. Marcus Garrett, Doc said slowly. That's the city councilman, right? The one who's been trying to rezone our clubhouse property so his developer buddies can build a strip mall. Yeah, Reaper chimed in, spitting a glob of chewing tobacco onto the gravel. Same prick. Thinks because he wears a tie, he runs this county. Hammer looked back down at Marin. The girl was still standing there, her whole body rigid with hope and terror waiting for his answer. He thought about Marcus Garrett, who had spent the last year calling the Hells Angels a menace, a blight criminals who needed to be driven out of respectable society. Garrett, who gave speeches about family values while apparently raising a son who beat up little girls at school. Hammer reached out a massive calloused hand and gently ruffled Marin's tangled hair. The gesture was surprisingly tender, coming from someone who looked like he could tear a phone book in half. Keep your $14, Marin, Hammer said. His voice was still rough, but there was a warmth in it now that hadn't been there before. Where is this school? What time does this little party start? Marin's good eye widened in disbelief. For a second, she couldn't speak, couldn't process that this terrifying giant had just agreed to help her. Pinewood Elementary. She finally managed her voice barely above a whisper. It starts at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Hammer nodded once decisive. He looked at his crew. Boys, looks like we got plans tomorrow. Bear grinned, showing teeth that were slightly crooked from too many bar fights. Haven't been to an elementary school in 30 years, boss. This should be interesting. Reaper cracked his knuckles, a sound like small bones breaking. Marcus Garrett's gonna shit himself. Doc just smiled quietly, already thinking 3 moves ahead, the way he always did. Hammer looked back at Marin one more time. Go back inside, kid. Tell your mama to lock the doors tonight if this Vince character comes around. And Marin, yes, sir, wear your best shirt tomorrow. You're gonna have a lot of dads showing up. As the bikers fired up their engines again, the roar vibrating through Marin's bones and shaking the windows of the diner, she watched them pull back onto Highway 9, heading toward the county line. She didn't know exactly what Hammer meant, but for the first time in her 9 years of life, Marin felt something strange and foreign blooming in her chest. It felt a lot like hope. She was still standing there watching the motorcycles disappear into the heat shimmer on the horizon when Claire burst out of the diner's front door. Her mother's face was pale, her eyes wide with worry. Marin Elizabeth Cole, what were you doing out here? Who were those men? Claire's hands were shaking as she grabbed Marin's shoulders, looking her over for new injuries. Did they hurt you? Did they say anything to you? They're gonna help me, Mama, Marin said quietly. She was still staring down the empty highway even though the bikes were long gone. Tomorrow at school, they're gonna help. Claire's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: confusion, fear, disbelief. Baby, those were Hell's Angels. You can't trust men like that. They're dangerous. They listened to me, Marin interrupted, finally looking up at her mother. I told them about Dylan and Mr. Garrett. I told them I needed help, and they said yes. Claire opened her mouth to argue, to explain all the reasons this was a terrible idea to forbid Marin from having anything to do with motorcycle gangs. But then she really looked at her daughter's face, not just at the bruise from Vince's hand, but at the expression in Marin's eyes. The tiny spark of something that Claire hadn't seen there in months. Hope. Claire's protest died on her lips. She pulled Marin into a tight hug, resting her chin on top of her daughter's head. Okay, baby, she whispered. Okay. That night, miles away from the highway diner at a fortified compound surrounded by chain-link fence and concertina wire, the Oak Haven charter of the Hells Angels held church. The clubhouse was a converted warehouse reinforced with steel plating and security cameras. Inside the main room was dominated by a long oak table scarred with cigarette burns and beer rings. Motorcycle memorabilia covered the walls, vintage patches, photographs of brothers, long dead confiscated police badges, and newspaper clippings documenting various arrests and acquittals over the decades. 32 men sat around that table, each one a full-patch member of the club. They ranged in age from mid-20s to late 60s, united by their loyalty to the patch and to each other. Some were covered in tattoos, others relatively clean-skinned. Some had prison records, others had never been caught. But all of them had earned their place at this table through blood and brotherhood. Hammerstone stood at the head of the table, his massive frame casting a shadow across the assembled members. The room had gone quiet when he called church to order cigarettes and beers temporarily forgotten. "We got a situation." Hammer began, his voice carrying easily across the room. "This afternoon at the Highway Diner, I was approached by a 9-year-old girl named Maren Cole." He paused, letting that sink in. A few of the younger members shifted uncomfortably, unsure where this was going. "Girl's got a black eye the size of my fist. Her mama's ex-boyfriend gave it to her when he came by looking for money. The girl's father abandoned her when she was 3. Now some punk kid at her elementary school has been terrorizing her for months, and tomorrow is Father-Daughter Day at the school. The bully told her if she shows up without a dad, he's gonna put her in the hospital." The room remained silent, but the energy had shifted. These were hard men, but many of them had daughters, sisters, nieces. They had all seen enough domestic violence in their lives to recognize it for the poison it was. A voice spoke up from the middle of the table. "What's this got to do with us, Hammer?" The speaker was Colt, a lean, hard-faced man in his early 40s who had been with the club for 15 years. Colt was a good brother, solid in a fight, but he believed fiercely in the principle of club. First outsiders, never. Hammer looked at Colt directly. "The bully is Dylan Garrett. His father is Marcus Garrett." Recognition rippled through the room. Marcus Garrett, the city councilman who had spent the past year trying to force the club out of Ridgemont. Marcus Garrett, who was in bed with Richard Copeland, the developer who wanted to bulldoze their clubhouse and build a shopping center. "That son of a bitch," muttered Wrench, a mechanic who ran the club's legitimate auto shop. "So what did you tell the girl?" Colt asked, his eyes narrowed. "I told her I'd be there tomorrow," Hammer said simply. The room erupted, not in anger exactly, but in a chaotic mixture of surprise, concern, and debate. Several members started talking at once, their voices overlapping. "Hammer man, we can't get involved in civilian shit. Marcus will use this against us. What if it's a setup?" Hammer let them talk for a moment, then raised one hand. The room fell silent immediately. "I know what I'm asking," Hammer said, his voice calm but firm. "I know this ain't club business in the traditional sense, but Marcus Garrett is already trying to take our land. He's already declared war on us. This little girl gave us a perfect excuse to remind the whole town who really has power in this county." Doc, the former lawyer, leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing, Hammer?" "Tomorrow morning we all ride to Pinewood Elementary for Father-Daughter Day. Full colors. We show up, we participate in the games, we make it crystal clear that Maren Cole is under our protection. We send a message that bullies, whether they're 12 years old or sitting on the city council, don't get to prey on the weak. Not in our town." Bear the giant with the 9-year-old daughter stood up. "I'm in, got a little girl myself. If someone was threatening Sophie and I wasn't around, I'd hope to God somebody would stand up for her. I vote yes." Reaper nodded. "Garrett wants to call us menaces. Let's show him what menaces really look like. I'm in." One by one, members started voicing their support, but not everyone was convinced. Colt stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the concrete floor. I respect what you're saying, Hammer. I do. But we're talking about walking into a civilian event surrounded by cops and cameras and parents who are terrified of us. One wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, and Marcus uses it to bring the full weight of the state down on our heads. We could lose everything we've built here. We're already losing it, Doc countered quietly. Marcus has the zoning board in his pocket. The eminent domain paperwork is probably already being drawn up. We can fight him in court for months, maybe years, and bleed ourselves dry on legal fees. Or we can make a public stand, show the people of Ridgemont that we're not the villains Marcus paints us to be. By crashing a kid's event, Colt shot back. By protecting a child who has nobody else. Hammer said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet that commanded attention. Look, I get it. This is risky. This isn't what we usually do, but that little girl looked me in the eye today and asked for help, and I'll be damned if I turn my back on her because it's politically complicated. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled members. My old man beat my mother to death when I was 12. I watched her die on the kitchen floor while that bastard slept it off in the next room. I spent years wishing someone, anyone, had stepped in to help. Well, now I can be that someone. We all can. The room had gone completely silent. Most of the members knew bits and pieces of Hammer's history, but he rarely spoke about his childhood with this kind of raw honesty. I'm not ordering anyone to ride tomorrow, Hammer continued. This is voluntary. But I'm asking you as your president and as your brother to stand with me on this. We vote now, all in favor of riding to Pinewood Elementary tomorrow morning to support Marin Cole. Raise your hand. Bear's hand shot up immediately. Then Reaper's. Doc raised his hand with a slight smile. One by one, hands went up around the table. Even some of the younger members who had looked uncertain joined in. When the count was done, 28 hands were raised. 4 members abstained, Colt among them. But 28 out of 32 was a clear majority. Motion carries, Hammer said. We ride it at 08:30 hours. Full dress code. Colors on. We're going to make an impression tomorrow, brothers. Let's make damn sure it's the right one. As the meeting broke up and members started filing out to their bikes or the bar area, Doc approached Hammer at the head of the table. You know this is going to poke the hornet's nest, Doc said quietly. Good, Hammer replied. I'm tired of tiptoeing around Marcus Garrett. Man wants a war, he's going to get one, but we'll fight it on our terms, not his. Doc nodded slowly. You really see yourself in this kid, don't you? Hammer didn't answer right away. He pulled out another cigarette, lit it, and took a long drag. Finally, he said, when she looked up at me with that black eye and asked for help, I saw Jackson Miller. The kid I was before I became this. He gestured to himself, to the leather vest and the scars and the hard shell he'd built over 40 years. Maybe I can't save that kid, but I can save her. Doc clapped him on the shoulder. Then let's go save her brother. Back at the small, run-down apartment Claire and Marin shared on the east side of Ridgemont, the night was not passing peacefully. Marin lay in her narrow bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, unable to sleep despite the late hour. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Rodriguez's television playing a Spanish-language soap opera, the dramatic music punctuated by occasional shouting. Her mind kept replaying the encounter with Hammer, examining it from every angle, looking for the catch. Men like that didn't help people for free. In Marin's experience, adults only did nice things when they wanted something in return. So what did the Hells Angels want? What would they demand as payment for tomorrow's protection? The thought made her stomach twist with anxiety. But even that fear was better than the alternative, Dylan's fists in the entire school watching her humiliation. In the next room, Claire sat at their cramped kitchen table nursing a cup of instant coffee she'd made too strong. She should be sleeping. Her shift at the diner started at 6 a.m., but her mind wouldn't stop racing. Hell's Angels. Her daughter had made a deal with the Hell's Angels. Claire had lived in Ridgemont long enough to know the club's reputation: drugs, violence, illegal weapons. The police couldn't prove half of what they suspected, but everyone knew the Hells Angels were dangerous. And yet when Marin had described the interaction, there had been something in her voice that Claire couldn't ignore. The man named Hammer had listened. He had asked questions. He had agreed to help without demanding money or favors. Claire's hand went to the bruise on her daughter's face, though Marin was in the other room. Vince had done that. Vince, who was supposed to be better than the bikers who worked a legitimate gym and came from a respectable family. Vince had looked her in the eye and smiled while he slapped her 9-year-old daughter. Maybe monsters came in all shapes and sizes. Maybe sometimes the scariest-looking people were the safest ones to trust. A sound outside made Claire freeze. Heavy footsteps on the exterior stairs. The creak of the third step that always stuck. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stood up, moving quietly to the window. Through the thin curtains, she saw him. Vince Keller swaying slightly at the bottom of the stairs, a six-pack of beer dangling from one hand. He had that look on his face, the one that meant he was just drunk enough to be mean, but not drunk enough to pass out. Claire moved quickly to the door, checking that the deadbolt was engaged. It was, but the lock was flimsy, the kind that would give way with one good kick. Vince reached the top of the stairs and pounded on the door with his fist. "Claire, open up, baby. Come on, don't be like that." Claire pressed her back against the wall next to the door, holding her breath. More pounding, harder this time. "I know you're in there. I can see the light under the door. Open up before I get mad." In the bedroom, Marin sat bolt upright, her heart racing. She recognized that voice, recognized the forced cheerfulness that would curdle into violence if he didn't get his way. "Claire," Vince was shouting now, not caring that it was past midnight, that he was waking up the whole building. "You owe me that money you've been hiding. I know you got tips tonight." Claire's hand went to her phone, thinking about calling the police. But what would they do? Vince hadn't actually broken in. And the last time she'd called them for a domestic disturbance, the cops had taken a statement and left, and Vince had made her pay for it later. "Fine," Vince yelled. "Fine, you want to play games? I'll come back tomorrow, and I'll get what's mine. You and that little brat can't hide from me forever." He punctuated this statement by kicking the door hard enough to make it rattle in its frame. Then his footsteps retreated down the stairs, followed by the sound of his truck starting up and tires squealing as he peeled out of the parking lot. Claire slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her whole body shaking. This couldn't go on. She couldn't keep living like this, in constant fear, always waiting for the next explosion. Marin appeared in the doorway to the bedroom, clutching the dog tag her father had left behind. Her small face was pale in the dim light. "Mama." Claire opened her arms and Marin ran into them, both of them, holding on tight in the dark apartment. "It's okay, baby," Claire whispered, though she wasn't sure which of them she was trying to convince. "It's okay, we're safe, the door's locked." Marin pulled back just enough to look at her mother's face. "Mama, do you think Hammer will really come tomorrow?" Claire brushed her daughter's tangled hair back from her forehead, careful not to touch the bruised side of her face. "I don't know, sweetheart. I hope so." "Me too," Marin whispered. She pulled out the small pin that Hammer had given her, a tiny silver badge shaped like a winged wheel that he'd unpinned from his vest. She held it up next to her father's dog tag, Two talismans from two very different men. Marin, what did that man say to you? Exactly. He said to wear my best shirt. He said I'd have a lot of dads there. Claire frowned, trying to understand. A lot of dads? What does that mean? But Marin just shrugged, clutching both the pin and the dog tag tight. I don't know, but I think it means I won't be alone. They stayed there on the kitchen floor for a long time, holding each other in the darkness, both of them thinking about tomorrow and what it might bring. Eventually, Claire carried her daughter back to bed, tucked her in, and sat beside her until Marin finally fell into an uneasy sleep. Claire returned to the kitchen table, the cold coffee still sitting where she'd left it. She picked up her phone, staring at the screen, thinking about all the choices that had led her to this moment. Daniel leaving, Vince showing up, the endless cycle of barely surviving, of trying to protect her daughter in a world that seemed designed to break them both. Tomorrow, a group of outlaws on motorcycles might show up at her daughter's school, or they might not. Claire had learned a long time ago not to count on anyone. But as she finally crawled into her own bed as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Claire found herself whispering a prayer she hadn't said since she was a child. Please, she whispered into the darkness, please let someone help us. Just this once. Please. Across town in a bedroom above the clubhouse, Hammerstone lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling fan, turning slowly overhead. Sleep wasn't coming easy tonight, which was unusual. He'd spent 40 years training himself to sleep anywhere, anytime, catching rest when he could between long rides and longer nights. But tonight his mind kept drifting back to the scrawny kid with the black eye, to the way she'd looked up at him with that mixture of terror and hope, asking a stranger to be her father for a day. Hammer reached over to his nightstand and pulled out an old photograph, yellowed and creased from being carried in a wallet for decades. The photo showed a woman with kind eyes and a tired smile, her arm around a skinny 12-year-old boy who stared at the camera with an expression that was already starting to harden. His mother, Rebecca Miller, dead for 40 years come October. I couldn't save you, Mama, Hammer whispered to the photograph. But maybe I can save this one. He tucked the photo back in the drawer, rolled over, and finally let sleep take him. Tomorrow was going to be a day Ridgemont wouldn't soon forget. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes after a desert night. The sky over Ridgemont stretched endless and blue, unmarred by even a single cloud. By 8 a.m., the temperature was already climbing toward the high 80s, promising another scorching day. At Pinewood Elementary School, the maintenance crew had been working since dawn. Colorful banners stretched across the chain-link fence surrounding the athletic field. Welcome Dads and Father-Daughter Day 2024. Paper decorations in pink and blue fluttered from the basketball hoops and flagpole. Someone had set up a professional barbecue station near the bleachers, and the smell of charcoal starting to heat filled the air. By 8:30, the parking lot was already half full. Minivans and SUVs pulled in one after another, disgorging fathers in polo shirts and khaki shorts, daughters in sundresses and carefully braided hair. The dads clustered in small groups, clutching styrofoam cups of bad coffee from the refreshment table, making small talk about golf handicaps and the Phoenix Suns' playoff chances. The daughters ran in excited packs across the grass, shrieking and laughing, comparing outfits and speculating about which team would win the three-legged race. For most of them, this was just another fun school event, a chance to spend time with their fathers, doing silly games and eating too much barbecue. For Marin Cole, it was something else entirely. She stood near the far corner of the fence, as far from the main crowd as she could get, without actually leaving school property. Her mother had driven her here at 8:45, parking Claire's battered Honda Civic in the back row, where it wouldn't stand out next to the newer vehicles. Marin wore her best shirt just like Hammer had told her to. It was a faded blue button-down that had belonged to her mother, carefully ironed that morning until the collar lay flat. Claire had even managed to French braid Marin's hair, taming the usual tangles into something presentable. The bruise on Marin's face had faded slightly over the past few days, shifting from deep purple to a sickly yellow-green, but it was still prominent enough that several parents had already given her pitying looks. Claire had been wanted to stay, but her shift at the diner started at 9 and they needed every dollar. Before she left, she had gripped Marin's shoulders and looked her straight in the eyes. "Baby, if those bikers don't show up, you come straight home. You hear me? Don't let Dylan touch you. Just leave. I'll handle the school." Marin had nodded, but she hadn't promised. If Hammer didn't come, she wasn't sure what she would do. Running away felt like surrender, but staying and getting beaten felt like defeat of a different kind. Now standing alone by the fence, Marin pulled out the two talismans she carried. Her father's dog tag on its chain around her neck, warm from her body heat. The small winged wheel pin Hammer had given her tucked safely in her pocket. She rubbed them both like worry stones, trying to will the universe to bring help. The clock on the side of the school building read 8:55 a.m. Principal Walsh, a thin, nervous man with a comb-over and a tendency to sweat through his shirts, stood at the microphone near the center of the field. "Good morning, families. Welcome to our annual Father-Daughter Field Day. We're so glad you could join us for this special tradition." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Marin's stomach twisted into knots. "We'll be starting with the three-legged race at 9 o'clock sharp." Principal Walsh continued, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "Then we'll move on to the woodworking station, the tug-of-war, and finish up with our barbecue lunch. Fathers, please make your way to the starting line with your daughters." The crowd began to shift, fathers and daughters pairing up and moving toward the white chalk line that marked the beginning of the race course. Marin stayed where she was frozen. She saw Dylan Garrett across the field standing next to his father, Marcus. Dylan was big for his age, wearing an expensive designer athletic shirt that probably cost more than Marin's entire wardrobe. He caught sight of her and smiled slow and predatory, then made an exaggerated gesture of looking around. "Where's your daddy Bennett?" his expression seemed to say. Marcus Garrett stood beside his son, tall and imposing in pressed linen pants and a crisp white shirt despite the heat. His Rolex caught the sunlight as he checked the time. Marcus had the kind of practiced charm that came from years in politics, all white teeth and firm handshakes. But Marin had seen him at city council meetings, on the local access channel, had watched the way his smile never quite reached his eyes. The clock read 9 o'clock a.m. Principal Walsh blew his whistle. "All right, everyone, to the starting line, please." Marin felt tears beginning to prick at her eyes. He wasn't coming. Of course he wasn't coming. What had she been thinking, that a motorcycle gang president was going to drop everything to help a random kid he had met once? That was fairy tale thinking, and Marin had learned years ago that fairy tales didn't come true for girls like her. Dylan started walking toward her, flanked by his two usual cronies. His smile had widened into a grin of pure malicious joy. Marin took a step backward, her shoulder blades hitting the chain-link fence. Her hands gripped the metal wire behind her, looking for something solid to hold on to. This was it. This was where it happened. In front of everyone, Dylan was going to make good on his threat, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Dylan was 10 feet away now, 8 feet, 6 feet. "Well, well, well," Dylan said, loud enough for the nearby families to hear. "Look who decided to show her ugly bruised face." Then she felt it, a vibration, not in her hands gripping the fence, but deeper, in her chest, in her bones. A low, rhythmic rumble that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Dylan paused mid-step, his smile faltering slightly. He looked around, confused. The rumble grew louder, deeper. It bypassed the ears entirely and resonated directly in the body, a subsonic growl that made water bottles on the picnic tables begin to vibrate, ripples spreading across their surfaces. Principal Walsh stopped mid-sentence, his head turning toward the street. The fathers stopped their conversations, cups of coffee frozen halfway to their lips. The daughters stopped running, standing still on the grass, looking around for the source of the sound. And then they appeared. Around the corner of Maple Street, moving in perfect 2-by-2 formation, came a procession of motorcycles unlike anything Pinewood Elementary had ever seen. 32 Harley-Davidson motorcycles, not 6, not a dozen, 32. They rode in disciplined military formation, engines synchronized in a thunderous chorus that shook the air itself. The sun-caught chrome exhaust pipes, high-rise handlebars, and polished custom paint jobs, creating a dazzling display of metal and power. At the head of the formation rode Hammer, his massive frame unmistakable even from a distance. No helmet, just dark sunglasses and his leather vest, sitting tall in the saddle with absolute confidence. Behind him, riding in tight formation, came 31 more members of the Hells Angels, each one wearing their full colors, their patches visible even from across the parking lot. The sound was apocalyptic. It wasn't just noise, it was a physical presence, a wall of mechanical thunder that announced their arrival like a herald of something ancient and unstoppable. Teachers gasped. Parents scrambled instinctively, pulling their children back from the fence line. Principal Walsh's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, no sound coming out. Marcus Garrett's face went from its usual healthy tan to a sickly pale white in the span of 3 seconds. His hand reflexively went to his phone in his pocket. Dylan's cocky smile evaporated completely, replaced by naked fear. The convoy didn't just drive past the school. Hammer raised one heavily tattooed arm, signaling the formation. As one unit, all 32 motorcycles turned off Maple Street and drove directly into the school's parking lot, right over the orange traffic cones that marked the VIP section reserved for staff and special guests. They executed the maneuver with military precision, backing their massive bikes into a perfect uniform line that stretched across the entire front of the parking lot. The kickstands came down in a synchronized wave of metallic clattering. Then one by one the engines cut off. The sudden silence that fell over the schoolyard was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. It was the silence of 100 people holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. 32 men dismounted from 32 motorcycles. They moved as one entity, boots hitting pavement in near unison. Heavy leather boots crunched on the asphalt. Chains rattled against denim. The sound of 32 men adjusting their vests, rolling their shoulders, cracking their knuckles. They looked like an invading army, because that's exactly what they were. Hammer led the wedge of bikers past the parking lot, past the refreshment tables where volunteers stood frozen with ladles of lemonade suspended in midair, past Principal Walsh, who looked like he might actually faint. The bikers walked onto the grass of the athletic field in a tight formation, their presence commanding absolute attention. The crowd parted for them like water around a rock. Parents pulled their daughters close. Fathers stepped protectively in front of their children, though none of them looked particularly eager to actually confront these men. Hammer's cold blue eyes scanned the crowd methodically, looking for one specific person. Then he found her. Marin stood pressed against the chain-link fence, her eyes huge in her small face, tears streaming down her cheeks. But they weren't tears of fear anymore. They were tears of overwhelming relief and disbelief. He came. He actually came. Hammer saw the tears. Saw Dylan Garrett standing frozen 6 feet away from Marin, his fist still half raised from whatever threatening gesture he had been making before the bikes arrived. And he saw Marcus Garrett standing near the bleachers, his expensive linen shirt already showing sweat stains, his face a mask of impotent rage and terror. Hammer stopped 2 feet in front of Marcus Garrett. At 6'4" and nearly 280 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, Hammer towered over the politician. His shadow completely engulfed Marcus, blocking out the morning sun. "You're in my way," Hammer growled, his voice carrying clearly across the silent playground, even though he wasn't shouting. Marcus stammered, his politician's charm completely failing him for the first time in his career. I, I'm sorry. What is the meaning of this? You men can't be here. This is a private school event. You're trespassing. I'm calling." "Move," Hammer said simply. Marcus stumbled backwards so fast he nearly tripped over his own expensive loafers, catching himself against the bleachers. His face was flushed with humiliation, but he didn't say another word. Hammer ignored him completely and walked to the fence where Marin stood. The terrifying, stone-cold expression on the biker's face melted away, replaced by a warm, genuine smile that transformed his scarred features into something almost gentle. He dropped to one knee on the grass, unbothered by the dirt stains this would leave on his jeans, bringing himself level with Marin's eyes. "Hey, kiddo," Hammer said softly, his rough voice pitched just for her. "Sorry I'm late. Hit some traffic on the I-10. He held out his massive, calloused hand, the same hand that had beaten men unconscious in bar fights, that had gripped motorcycle handlebars for 40 years of hard riding. But when Marin took it, his grip was gentle. "You ready to win that three-legged race?" Marin stared at the giant man, then looked past him at the sea of leather and patches. 32 of the most feared men in Arizona, all standing behind him. All here for her. A smile broke across Marin's bruised body, radiant and transformative. She reached out and grabbed Hammer's hand with both of hers. "Yeah, Dad," Marin said, her voice loud and clear and certain. "I'm ready." A ripple went through the crowd. Some parents looked shocked. Others looked confused. A few of the mothers had tears in their eyes, understanding on an instinctive level what they were witnessing. Hammer stood up, still holding Marin's hand, and turned to face Principal Walsh. The administrator was dabbing at his forehead with his handkerchief, looking like a man who desperately wished he'd called in sick today. "Principal Walsh, is it?" Hammer's voice was polite but left no room for argument. "I'm here for Father-Daughter Day. With my daughter." "That a problem?" Behind Hammer, 31 bikers stood in a loose semicircle, was cross-waisted neutral, but their mere presence speaking volumes. Principal Walsh swallowed hard. He looked at Marcus Garrett as if hoping the city councilman would tell him what to do. But Marcus was still pressed against the bleachers, wisely keeping his mouth shut for once in his life. Walsh looked back at Hammer, then down at Marin. The little girl was gripping the biker's hand like a lifeline, her face shining with hope. "No," Principal Walsh said finally, his voice only shaking a little. "No problem at all. Welcome to Pinewood Elementary." Hammer nodded once. "Appreciate it." The transition from absolute terror to surreal festivity happened with the kind of bizarre speed that would have been comical if it hadn't been so emotionally charged. Principal Walsh, to his credit, recovered his composure with admirable speed. He cleared his throat, tapped the microphone, and said in a voice that was almost steady, "Well then, let's get started with our three-legged race, shall we, fathers and daughters? Please make your way to the starting line." Hammer looked down at Marin. "You ever done one of these before?" Marin shook her head. "Me neither. Guess we'll figure it out together." He reached into his vest and pulled out a heavy-duty nylon tie-down strap, the industrial kind used to secure motorcycles to trailer beds. "This'll work better than those cheap cloth strips they got over there." He knelt down and wrapped the strap around his massive right leg and Marin's small left leg, cinching it snug but not tight enough to hurt. "All right, kid. We ain't built for speed, so we're gonna win this on intimidation. When the whistle blows, you just try to keep up. I'll do the heavy lifting." They walked to the starting line together. Hammer's strides shortened to match Marin's smaller steps. Already, Marin could feel the stares from the other participants. Fathers in their polo shirts and boat shoes looking at the mountain of a man in leather and patches like he was an alien species. 2 lanes over stood Dylan Garrett and his father Marcus. The councilman had recovered some of his composure, though his shirt was now visibly soaked with sweat. He was trying to maintain his political smile, but it looked like someone had painted it on with a shaky hand. Dylan wouldn't even look in Marin's direction. Every time he shifted his weight, he found himself in the line of sight of one biker or another. Reaper, the bald enforcer, was staring at the boy with an expression that could freeze blood. Bear, the 2-meter giant, cracked his knuckles loudly every few seconds, a sound like small bones breaking. Principal Walsh raised the starting whistle to his lips. His hand was shaking so badly it took him 2 tries to get it to his mouth. "On your marks, get set." The whistle blew, though it came out as more of a wheeze. Chaos erupted on the starting line. Fathers stumbled and barked orders at their daughters. Little girls shrieked as they lost their balance. One pair went down immediately in a tangle of limbs. But Hammer and Marin moved with surprising coordination. Hammer had set the pace before they even started his right leg, and Marin's left leg moving in perfect synchronization. He practically carried her with each massive stride, his hand on her shoulder steadying her. They were a juggernaut, unstoppable and relentless. Marin found herself laughing, actually laughing, as they surged ahead of the other competitors. The wind whipped her braided hair behind her. Hammer's grin was fierce and proud. They crossed the finish line a full 10 seconds before anyone else crashing into the hay bales that marked the end of the course in a tumble of leather and giggles. A cheer went up from the 31 Hells Angels lining the track, a roar of approval that drowned out the polite applause from the other parents. "That's how you ride, brother," Bear bellowed, crushing his styrofoam cup of lemonade in his massive fist and tossing it aside. Reaper sauntered over and hoisted Marin onto his shoulders in one smooth motion, despite her surprised squeak. "Undisputed champions of Pinewood Elementary," he announced to the crowd. "Somebody get this girl a trophy." Chain, a quieter biker who rarely spoke, appeared with 2 hot dogs from the barbecue station, handing them to Marin and Hammer. "Winners eat first," he said simply. For the next 2 hours, the Hells Angels became the most attentive, albeit terrifying surrogate fathers in the history of the school. At the woodworking station, the PTA volunteers had set up tables with pre-cut wood pieces, child-safe hammers, and dull nails for building simple birdhouses. The instructions were clear: use the materials provided, supervise your daughters, keep it simple. Wrench, the club's mechanic, took one look at the plastic safety scissors and nearly laughed out loud. Instead, he produced a beautiful custom-forged hunting knife from a sheath on his belt. The blade gleamed in the sunlight, clearly honed to a razor edge. The PTA volunteer manning the station, a suburban mother named Karen, went pale. "Sir, you can't use that. We have safety protocols." "Ma'am," Wrench said politely, "I've been working with blades since I was 6 years old. My daughter here is going to have the best birdhouse at this event, and she's going to learn proper craftsmanship while doing it. You got a problem with that?" Beside him, Marin looked up at Karen with her big eyes and her fading bruise and her hopeful expression. Karen wisely decided this was not a hill worth dying on. "Just be careful, please." 20 minutes later, Marin held in her hands a miniature replica of a motorcycle gas tank carved from a block of pine with intricate detail. Wrench had let her do some of the easier cuts under his supervision, his large hands guiding her smaller ones, teaching her how to work with the grain of the wood. "There you go, kiddo," Wrench said, ruffling her hair. "First rule of building, use the right tools for the job. Second rule, take pride in your work. This is yours now. You made it." Marin clutched the carved piece like it was made of gold. The tug-of-war event was supposed to be the highlight of the day, a test of strength and teamwork between fathers and daughters. A thick hemp rope had been laid across the field, and a heavy metal stake had been driven deep into the ground as an anchor point. When it was time for the Hells Angels' turn, Bear Iron Mike, a club member who looked like his name suggested, and two other bikers grabbed one end of the rope. Their daughters weren't with them, so Marin, along with two other girls whose fathers were bikers, held onto their waists. On the other end of the rope, five father-daughter pairs gripped tight, ready to pull. Principal Walsh blew the whistle. Bear didn't even bother with strategy. He simply started walking backward, pulling the rope hand over hand like he was reeling in a fishing line. The five pairs on the other end dug in their heels, leaned back, pulled with everything they had. It didn't matter. Bear and his brothers walked them across the center line in under 10 seconds. But then Bear got enthusiastic. He gave one final massive pull. The five pairs on the other end went tumbling forward in a heap, and the metal stake, which was supposed to be anchoring the rope, ripped straight out of the ground with a spray of dirt and grass. The crowd gasped. Principal Walsh looked like he might creak. Bear looked at the uprooted stake, then at the principal, then shrugged. "Sorry about that, we'll put it back." Doc, the former lawyer who was the most diplomatic of the group, quickly approached Walsh. "The club will cover any damages to the field, principal. We'll have a landscaping crew here Monday morning. Professional grade work, better than it was before. No charge to the school." Walsh just nodded weakly, too overwhelmed to argue. At the barbecue station, the PTA had set up a modest spread: burgers, hot dogs, chips, lemonade. They'd calculated enough food for about 60 people, maybe 70 if they stretched it. They hadn't calculated for 32 Hells Angels with motorcycle metabolism. Hammer approached the PT, a mother's running the barbecue, pulling a money clip from his vest. "Ladies, what's it gonna cost to buy out your whole setup?" "Everything you got." One of the mothers, braver than the rest, stuttered out a number. "We were charging $3 per plate, and we have about 40 plates worth of food left, so $120. Hammer peeled off three $100 bills and handed them over. "Keep the change for the library fund or whatever you need, and triple the order. I'll cover it. Every kid here eats free today, not just the ones with us." The PTA mothers stared at the money in shock. You're donating to the school?" one of them asked, incredulous. "Why not?" Hammer replied. "Good education's important. Kids deserve it." Within 30 minutes, reinforcement supplies had been brought in from a local grocery store, and the barbecue was restocked. True to Hammer's word, every child at the event got a free meal, whether their parents could afford it or not. Several of the lower-income families who had been rationing their tickets to make their limited budgets stretch found themselves able to get seconds and thirds. Marin sat on a picnic blanket surrounded by bikers, a plate piled high with food in her lap. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this full, this safe, this happy. For the first time in her 9 years of life, she understood what it felt like to be protected, to have people stand up for her, not because they had to, but because they chose to. But not everyone was celebrating. Marcus Garrett stood in the shadow of the bleachers, watching the spectacle unfold with a mixture of humiliation and rage so intense it made his hands shake. His entire political career had been built on projecting authority, on being the biggest presence in any room, on making people defer to his power. And these outlaw bikers were making him look like a joke in front of his constituents, in front of his son. in front of everyone who mattered. His phone was already in his hand thumb, hovering over a contact labeled Sheriff Barnes. He'd been planning to wait to be strategic about this, but the humiliation was too fresh, too raw. These animals needed to be put in their place. Marcus stepped further into the shadow, ensuring no one could overhear, and made the call. "Sheriff Barnes," came the gruff voice on the other end. "Tom, it's Marcus. I need you at Pinewood Elementary immediately. We have a situation." "What kind of situation?" Barnes sounded skeptical. He'd known Marcus long enough to recognize when the councilman was being dramatic. "Gang activity, trespassing. I've got 30-plus Hells Angels on school property, intimidating families, potentially armed. I want them removed, in handcuffs if necessary." There was a long pause. "Marcus, it's a Saturday morning. This better not be some political grandstanding bullshit." "Get down here, Tom. That's not a request." Marcus hung up before the sheriff could argue further. His smile was cold and vindictive. Let these bikers think they'd won. In 20 minutes, they'd be face down on the ground with police knees in their backs, and Marcus would be the hero who protected the children from the dangerous criminals. Across the field, Claire Cole had just pulled into the parking lot in her beat-up Honda, her shift at the diner having ended early due to an unexpected lull in customers. She told herself she was just going to pick up Marin, that she wasn't going to stick around and watch. But as she got out of her car and saw her daughter laughing, truly laughing, surrounded by a protective wall of leather and muscle, Claire felt something break open in her chest. Marin hadn't laughed like that in years, maybe ever. Claire started walking toward the field, drawn by her daughter's joy like a moth to flame. As she got closer, she could see Hammer sitting on the grass beside Marin, showing her something on his phone. The massive biker looked up as Claire approached, and for a moment their eyes met. Hammer stood up immediately, a gesture of respect that surprised Claire. Most men didn't stand for waitresses. "Ma'am," Hammer said, his voice polite, "you must be Marin's mother." "Claire," she managed her throat tight. "Claire Cole. Gary Stone, friends call me Hammer." They shook hands. His grip was firm but careful, mindful of his strength. "I don't know how to thank you," Claire said, her eyes already welling with tears. "You didn't have to do this. You don't even know us." "Kid asked for help," Hammer said simply. "Seemed like the right thing to do." Before Claire could respond, Marin crashed into her, wrapping thin arms around her mother's waist. "Mama, did you see we won the race and Wrench made me this?" She held up the carved gas tank. "And I got to eat 3 hot dogs." Claire laughed through her tears, holding her daughter close. "I saw, baby. I saw." Doc approached, then having observed the interaction, he extended his hand to Claire. "Ma'am, I'm Nathan Cross. I want you to know we'll make sure Marin gets home safe after this event. And if you ever have trouble with that Vince character again, you call this number." He handed her a business card. It was plain white, no fancy logo, just a phone number and the words, "Legal Services, Nathan Cross Esquire." "You're a lawyer?" Claire asked, surprised. "Was. Still am, technically. Just ride motorcycles in my spare time now." Doc smiled gently. "Point is, you or Marin need help legal, or otherwise you call. We take care of our own." "But we're not." "You are now," Doc said simply. The sound of sirens in the distance made everyone go quiet. 2 Oak Haven police cruisers were approaching, lights flashing, pulling into the school parking lot with deliberate slowness. The bikers didn't scatter or panic. They simply stood up, positioning themselves in a loose formation with Marin and Claire at the center. Not aggressive, but protective, making a statement. Sheriff Tom Barnes stepped out of the lead cruiser. He was in his early 60s, gray-haired and weathered, with the kind of face that had seen too much to be impressed by much of anything anymore. His hand rested on his service belt, but he hadn't drawn his weapon. Marcus Garrett practically sprinted across the grass to meet him. "Sheriff, thank God you're here. I want these men arrested immediately. Trespassing, disturbing the peace, potentially armed." Barnes held up one hand, cutting Marcus off. "Slow down, councilman. Let me assess the situation." The sheriff's eyes swept across the scene. He saw the bikers in their leather and patches. He saw the families scattered across the field. He saw children eating barbecue and playing on the grass. He saw Marin Cole holding her mother's hand, a carved wooden gas tank in her other hand, looking at the bikers with absolute trust. Barnes walked slowly toward Hammer. The two men looked at each other with the kind of mutual recognition that comes from 20 years of carefully negotiated détente. "Hammer," Barnes said neutrally. Sheriff De Hammer replied in the same tone. "Got a call about a disturbance. You disturbing the peace?" "No, sir. Participating in Father-Daughter Day with my kid." Hammer gestured to Marin. "That a crime?" Barnes looked down at Marin, taking in the fading bruise on her face, the way she was pressed close to her mother. Then he looked back at the 31 other bikers, all of whom were standing calm and composed. "Anybody been threatened?" Barnes called out to the crowd. "Anybody been hurt or intimidated?" Silence. The parents looked at each other nervously, but none of them spoke up. Because the truth was, aside from the initial shock of the arrival, the bikers had been nothing but polite, helpful even. Principal Walsh showing more courage than Marcus had given him credit for stepped forward. "Sheriff, I invited these gentlemen to participate in our event. They've been model citizens. Actually donated several $100s to our school programs." Barnes nodded slowly. He turned back to Marcus Garrett, and there was something in his expression that the councilman didn't like. "Marcus, can I speak with you privately for a moment?" The two men walked a short distance away. Barnes's voice was low, but several people nearby could hear snatches of the conversation. "Wasting department resources. Told you before about Crying Wolf. They're not breaking any laws." Marcus's face went from pale to flushed red. "I'm a city councilman. I have the authority." "You have the authority to make my life difficult," Barnes interrupted, his voice sharp. "But you don't have the authority to order arrests without probable cause. These men are participating in a public school event. They're not drunk, they're not fighting, they haven't threatened anyone. What exactly do you want me to charge them with?" "They're Hell's Angels," Marcus hissed. "Being a member of a motorcycle club isn't illegal, Marcus. You know that. I know you don't like them. I know you've been trying to force them out of the county, but unless they actually break a law, my hands are tied." Marcus opened his mouth to argue further, but Barnes cut him off. "Now I'm going to get back in my cruiser and leave. And you're going to let this event finish peacefully. Because if I have to come back here today, I'm going to be in a very bad mood. And you don't want me in a bad mood when I start looking into who's been making false police reports. That's a misdemeanor, Marcus, even for councilmen." Barnes turned on his heel and walked back to his cruiser, his deputy following. As he passed Hammer, he gave the slightest nod. Hammer returned it. The cruisers pulled away, leaving Marcus standing alone in the middle of the field, publicly humiliated for the second time that day. Dylan Garrett had watched the whole thing from a distance. He saw his father's face turn red, saw the sheriff leave without arresting anyone, saw the bikers still standing tall and protective around Marin Cole. For the first time in his life, Dylan understood what it felt like to be powerless, to want to hurt someone and not be able to have your father's authority mean nothing. He didn't like it, not one bit. The Father-Daughter Day continued for another hour, but the mood had shifted. The other families started to relax around the bikers, realizing that these men, terrifying as they looked, weren't actually there to cause trouble. A few of the braver fathers even approached to shake hands, offering awkward thanks for the donated barbecue. Some of the daughters asked to see the motorcycles, and the bikers obliged, showing them the custom paint jobs and explaining the basics of the engines in simple terms. By the time the event wound down at 2 p.m., Pinewood Elementary had experienced something it would talk about for years to come. As the family started to pack up and head home, Hammer knelt down one last time in front of Marin. "You did good today, kid," he said quietly. "Thank you," Marin whispered. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for everything." Hammer reached into his vest and carefully unpinned a small silver badge shaped like a winged wheel. It was worn smooth from years of wear, clearly something important to him. He pressed it into Marina's palm, closing her small fingers around it. "You're an honorary prospect now, Marin. That means your family. You need us. You just look at the road. We'll hear you. We'll come." Marin's eyes filled with tears. She threw her arms around Hammer's neck, hugging him with all the strength in her small body. Hammer stiffened for just a moment, then carefully hugged her back, his massive arms gentle around her fragile frame. Claire watched this with her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming freely down her face now. When Marin finally let go, she stepped back next to her mother. Claire put her arm around her daughter's shoulders and looked up at Hammer. "I don't know what we did to deserve this kindness," Claire said softly, "but thank you, from the bottom of my heart." Hammer nodded once. Then he glanced past Claire and Marin to where Dylan and Marcus Garrett were loading their things into an expensive SUV. The councilman was talking rapidly on his phone, his free hand gesturing angrily. "This ain't over," Hammer said quietly, more to himself than to Claire. "Man like that doesn't let humiliation slide. He's gonna come back at us." "What do you mean?" Claire asked, alarm creeping into her voice. Doc, who had been standing nearby, stepped closer. "Marcus has been trying to seize our clubhouse property for months. Eminent domain zoning violations, you name it. Today we embarrassed him publicly. He's going to retaliate. It's not a question of if, just when and how." Claire's face went pale. "Because of us, because you helped Marin." "No," Hammer said firmly. "We were already at war with Garrett. This just brought it into the open. And honestly, I prefer my wars out in the open where I can see them coming." He looked down at Marin one more time. "You stay strong, kid. And remember, you got an army now. Anyone messes with you, they mess with all of us." The 32 bikers mounted their motorcycles, the engines roaring to life in a symphony of mechanical thunder. They pulled out of the parking lot in the same disciplined formation they'd arrived in, disappearing down Maple Street toward the county line. Marin stood holding her mother's hand, the winged wheel pin clutched tight in her other hand, watching them go. She didn't know it yet, but Hammer was right. This wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. And the storm that was coming would test every promise that had been made today, every bond that had been forged. But for now, for this one perfect moment, Marin Cole felt something she'd never felt before in her entire life. She felt like she belonged to someone, like someone would fight for her, like she had a father. Even if he wore leather and rode a Harley and had a death's head patch on his back. Maybe especially because of that. 48 hours after Father-Daughter Day at Pinewood Elementary, the fragile peace that had settled over Ridgemont shattered like glass under a hammer. Marcus Garrett sat in his mahogany-paneled office at City Hall, staring at the wall of framed photographs that documented his rise to power. Campaign posters, handshake photos with the governor, newspaper clippings praising his business acumen and civic leadership. 20 years of carefully constructed authority, all of it undermined in a single morning by a pack of criminals on motorcycles. His humiliation had been complete, public, witnessed by voters, by fellow council members, by his own son. The video footage was already circulating online, shaky smartphone recordings of 32 Hells Angels riding into an elementary school while Marcus Garrett stood helpless and sweating. The comments were brutal. Garrett got owned by bikers LOL. Where's your authority now, councilman? Those bikers showed more class than Garrett ever has. His phone had been ringing nonstop. Concerned supporters asking if he was all right. Political rivals barely concealing their glee. Reporters wanting statements. And through it all, the burning knowledge that he had been made to look weak. Marcus Garrett had built his entire identity on never being weak, on being the man who controlled outcomes, who bent situations to his will. Weakness was unacceptable. Weakness was death in politics. So on Monday morning, Marcus made a series of phone calls, the kind of calls that happened behind closed doors where favors were traded and backs were scratched and the machinery of corruption ground smoothly along. First call, Richard Copeland, the commercial developer who had been lobbying for months to acquire the land where the Hells Angels clubhouse stood. Copeland wanted to bulldoze the warehouse and build a massive retail complex that would generate millions in revenue and make both men considerably richer through a labyrinth of kickbacks and shell corporations. Richard, it's time. Fast-track the eminent domain paperwork. I want that clubhouse condemned by end of business today. Marcus, we discussed waiting until after the election, keeping this quiet. I don't care about quiet anymore. I want them gone. Use every code violation you can find. Structural integrity, environmental hazards, noise ordinances. I want an eviction notice on their gate by midnight tonight. Second call. The county health inspector, a man whose continued employment depended heavily on Marcus's goodwill. Jerry, you remember that little diner on Highway 9, Rosa's place? I need you to pay them a visit. Find violations, lots of them, and make it clear that the only way those violations disappear is if they terminate one specific employee, Claire Cole, the waitress. Marcus, I can't just... You can and you will, unless you want me to audit your department's budget requests for the next decade. Third call. His lawyer, a sharp corporate attorney who knew how to weaponize the legal system. Draw up harassment complaints against the Hells Angels. Find parents from the school willing to sign affidavits that they felt threatened. I don't care if you have to pay I want ammunition for when this goes to court. By noon, Marcus Garrett's retaliation machine was in full motion. The county health inspector showed up at the Highway Diner at 1:15 p.m. clipboard, in-hand expression, apologetic but firm. He spent 2 hours going through the kitchen with a fine-tooth comb, citing violations that ranged from legitimate to completely fabricated. Rosa, the elderly owner who had run the diner for 30 years, stood in her kitchen crying as the inspector filled out form after form. Rosa, I'm sorry, the inspector said quietly when they were alone, but I have direct orders from the city council. Either you fire Claire Cole immediately, or I shut you down by Friday. Those are your only options. But Claire is my best worker. She's done nothing wrong. I know, but this isn't about her work performance. This is politics. I'm sorry. At 3 p.m., Rosa called Claire into her small office and delivered the news with shaking hands and tear-stained cheeks. Claire stood there in her stained waitress uniform, the final paycheck in her hands feeling as heavy as a death sentence. Without this job, she couldn't pay rent, couldn't feed Marin, couldn't survive. Marcus Garrett did this, didn't he? Claire asked quietly. Rosa nodded, unable to speak. Because we asked the bikers for help. Another nod. Claire carefully folded the paycheck and put it in her apron pocket. It's not your fault, Rosa. You do what you have to do to keep the diner. I understand. But understanding didn't pay bills. Understanding didn't put food on the table. Claire walked out of the Highway Diner at 3:30 p.m., officially unemployed with 8 days until rent was due and $53 in her checking account. She sat in her car in the parking lot and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to fall apart. 5 minutes of tears and terror and rage at the unfairness of a world where helping your daughter made you a target. Then she dried her eyes, started the car, and drove to pick up Marin from school. Because that's what mothers did. They kept going even when everything was falling apart. That same afternoon at the Hells Angels clubhouse, Hammerstone was working on his bike in the garage bay when Reaper came running in waving a manila envelope. "Boss, we got a problem?" The entire club had assembled in the main room within 10 minutes. Hammer ripped open the envelope that had been taped to their front gate by a nervous county deputy who'd clearly drawn the short straw for this particular assignment. Inside was a thick stack of legal documents stamped with official seals and the signatures. Hammer read aloud, his voice getting colder with each line. Notice of immediate condemnation and eminent domain seizure. Property located at 4747 County Line Road, deemed structurally unsafe and environmentally hazardous. Residents have 72 hours to vacate premises. Failure to comply will result in forcible removal by law enforcement and demolition crew. Signed by Councilman Marcus Garrett and the County Zoning Commission. The room erupted in angry voices. Fists slammed on tables. Chairs scraped back as men stood up ready to ride to City Hall and settle this the old-fashioned way. "That son of a bitch," Bear roared, "Bud. He's fast-tracking the Copeland deal just to spite us." 72 hours, Wrench spat on the floor. "They can't legally do this. We own this land free and clear." Colt, who had voted against helping Marin in the first place, stood up slowly. His face was grim, but when he spoke there was no "I told you so" in his voice. Just cold anger. "Legality doesn't matter when you own the judges and the zoning board. Garrett's been planning this for months. The school thing just gave him the excuse to pull the trigger early." Hammer stood at the head of the table, the eviction notice crumpling in his massive fist. He was silent, his ice-blue eyes staring at nothing, his jaw working. The room gradually went quiet as the members waited to see what their president would do. Before Hammer could speak, his cell phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. "Yeah, Mr. Stone, this is Claire Cole." Her voice was shaking thick with barely controlled tears. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I didn't know who else to call." "What happened?" Hammer's voice immediately shifted from cold anger to focused concern. Claire told him about the health inspector, about Rosa being forced to fire her, about Marcus Garrett's retaliation. "I'm not calling to ask for money," Claire said quickly. "I just wanted to warn you. I heard a rumor that Garrett is going after your clubhouse too, and I thought you should know. This is my fault. If I hadn't let Marin ask you for help—" "Stop," Hammer interrupted firmly. "This ain't your fault, Claire. Marcus Garrett declared war on us long before we met your daughter. You and Marin just gave us something worth fighting for instead of just fighting against." He paused, listening to Claire's quiet crying on the other end of the line. "Garrett didn't just come for our house," Hammer said loud enough for the whole room to hear. "He went after the girl's mother, took away her livelihood because she dared to protect her kid." The effect on the assembled bikers was immediate. The anger in the room shifted from hot and chaotic to cold and focused. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was about a man using his power to hurt a waitress and a 9-year-old girl. Bear stood up, his massive hands clenched into fists. Give the word hammer. We ride to Garrett's house tonight. Show him what happens when you threaten families. No! Hammer's voice cracked like a whip. That's exactly what he wants. He wants us to act like the violent criminals he tells everyone we are. He wants an excuse to send the state police, the feds, every badge in Arizona down on our heads. Hammer's eyes swept across the room, making eye contact with each member. We don't win this fight with our fists. We win it by being smarter than he is. He turned to Doc, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, his reading glasses perched on his nose, already thinking 3 moves ahead, like the chess player he was. Doc, Hammer said, you've been digging into Copeland and Garrett's finances for the past month. You told me you found something that smelled wrong. What exactly did you find? Doc stood up, slowly removing his glasses and polishing them on his shirt, a nervous habit from his lawyer days that he'd never quite shed. When he put them back on, his eyes were sharp and calculating. I found more than a smell, Hammer. I found the whole rotting corpse. He walked to a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder, laying it on the oak table with a satisfying thump. Marcus Garrett has been taking kickbacks from Richard Copeland for the past 8 months. The money is being funneled through a shell corporation called Apex Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands. Apex Holdings has one single beneficiary and signatory, Marcus J. Garrett. Doc pulled out bank statements, highlighting key figures with a yellow marker as he spoke. Copeland has wired exactly $1.2 million into this offshore account in installments designed to stay just under federal reporting requirements. In exchange, Garrett has been manipulating zoning regulations, fast-tracking permits, and setting up this eminent domain seizure to hand our land to Copeland for development. It's textbook bribery, wire fraud, and extortion, the kind of corruption that makes federal prosecutors salivate. The room had gone completely silent. Every eye was locked on Doc. Hammer leaned forward. Can you prove it in front of a crowd in a way that can't be dismissed or covered up? Doc smiled, the kind of smile that had once made opposing counsel very nervous in Chicago courtrooms. I have the offshore routing numbers. I have the email correspondence between Garrett and Copeland discussing the payments. I have bank statements from both the Cayman account and Copeland's corporate accounts showing matching withdrawals and deposits. It's ironclad. Then tomorrow night, Hammer said slowly, a plan crystallizing in his mind. We go to war, but we do it in public in the light where Garrett can't hide. Bear frowned. What do you mean? Tomorrow night is the monthly open town hall meeting, Doc explaining, catching on to Hammer's thinking. Public comment period. Anyone can speak, and everything is recorded, live-streamed, available to press. Hammer nodded. Garrett is planning to attend that meeting and hold a victory lap vote on our eviction. He thinks he's won. He thinks we're going to hole up here and wait for the bulldozers. Instead, we're going to walk into that town hall and destroy him in front of the entire county. Colt stood up. Walk in how in our colors, they'll arrest us before we get to the microphone. No. Hammer said, a fierce grin spreading across his scarred face. We walk in wearing suits, looking like businessmen, looking respectable. And then we pull out the evidence and watch Marcus Garrett's world burn down around him. The room erupted in approving shouts and laughter. It was brilliant, aggressive without being violent, public without being illegal, using Garrett's own system against him. We need suits by tomorrow night, Reaper pointed out. None of us own suits. I know a tailor, Doc said. Owes me a favor from the old days. If we get there tonight, he can have 32 suits ready by tomorrow afternoon. Won't be custom, but they'll fit and look professional. Do it, Hammer ordered. Everyone gets measured tonight. Tomorrow we clean up, cut our hair, shave our beards, or trim them neat. We're going to look like the most intimidating board of directors anyone's ever seen. He pulled out his phone and called Claire back. Claire, tomorrow night, 7 p.m., Ridgemont Town Hall. I need you to be there. Wear your best clothes, bring Marin. Can you do that? Why? Claire's voice was confused, still thick with tears. Because the town needs to see the people Garrett is trying to destroy. They need to see a hardworking mother and her daughter who just wanted help. They need to see that we're not the monsters Garrett paints us to be. There was a long pause. Then Claire said quietly, "We'll be there." "Good. Trust me, Claire. This is gonna work." After he hung up, Doc approached Hammer at the head of the table. "You know this is going to make Garrett desperate," Doc said quietly. "Desperate men do dangerous things." "I know," Hammer replied, "but I'm tired of living under his thumb, tired of waiting for the hammer to fall. Tomorrow night we take our lives back." Doc nodded slowly, then said something that had been on his mind since Saturday. "You really care about that kid, don't you, Marin?" Hammer didn't answer immediately. He stared at the eviction notice still crumpled in his hand, thinking about a 9-year-old girl with a black eye asking a stranger to be her father. Thinking about his own mother dying on a kitchen floor while he held her hand. "Yeah," he said finally. "Yeah, I do." The next day was a whirlwind of preparation. 32 bikers descended on Doc's tailor friend, an elderly Italian man named Mr. Rossini, who took one look at the Hells Angels filling his small shop and nearly fainted before Doc explained the situation. By late afternoon, 32 black suits hung in garment bags at the clubhouse, ranging in size from Reaper's lean medium to Bear's custom XXL. The barbershop downtown had its busiest day in years. Bikers who hadn't had a professional haircut in decades sat in the chairs, watching their long hair fall to the floor. Beards were trimmed or shaved entirely. Tattoos were left visible, but everything else was made as presentable as possible. When they assembled at the clubhouse at 5 p.m. on Tuesday, the transformation was stunning. 32 men who had looked like dangerous outlaws 24 hours ago now looked like an extremely intimidating corporate security firm. Hammer stood in front of a mirror, barely recognizing himself. His beard was trimmed close, his hair actually combed. The black suit fit surprisingly well across his massive frame. He looked like a bouncer at an expensive nightclub or maybe a bodyguard for a Fortune 500 CEO. "Damn, boss," Reaper said, coming up beside him in his own suit. "We clean up nice." Bear walked by, tugging at his collar uncomfortably. "I feel like I'm wearing a costume. How do people breathe in these things?" "You wear it for a few hours, make Garrett piss his pants. Then we go home and put our real clothes back on," Hammer said. "Now let's go make some history." The Ridgemont Town Hall was a historic building from the 1920s, all high ceilings and wood paneling, and the kind of civic gravitas that made people unconsciously lower their voices. By 6:30 p.m., the main meeting room was packed to capacity. Word had spread through town about the drama at the elementary school, about Claire Cole being fired, about the Hells Angels facing eviction. People were curious, some were concerned, many just wanted to see what would happen next in this increasingly bizarre situation. Marcus Garrett sat at the center of the raised dais where the city council conducted business, flanked by 4 other council members, who mostly just did whatever Marcus told them to do. He wore a crisp navy suit, his hair perfectly styled, his American flag lapel pin catching the light. He looked confident, victorious, like a man who had already won. The agenda was simple: approve the eminent domain seizure of the property at 4747 County Line Road, vote to hand development rights to the Copeland Corporation, move on to other business. It should take 10 minutes, 15 tops, a formality. At 6:55 p.m., Marcus called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. Good evening, citizens of Ridgemont. We have several items on tonight's agenda, but I know many of you are here for the vote on Resolution 404 regarding the eminent domain seizure of the unsafe industrial property on County Line Road. He smiled as politicians smile. Before we vote, Town Charter requires a period of public comment. Does anyone wish to speak on this matter? Sheriff Barnes, who was leaning against the back wall of the room in full uniform, raised his voice. Actually, Marcus, I think you'll find quite a few people want to speak tonight. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall opened. Every head in the room turned. The murmur of conversation died instantly. 32 men walked into the Ridgemont Town Hall in single file, moving with military precision. They wore black suits that fit like armor, white shirts, dark ties. Their hair was neatly trimmed, their faces clean-shaven, or beards groomed to perfection. But there was no mistaking who they were. The way they moved, the scars that couldn't be hidden by clothing, the sheer physical presence of men who had lived hard lives and survived harder fights. Walking at the front of the procession, holding Hammer's hand on one side and her mother's hand on the other, was Marin Cole. She wore a simple blue dress that Claire had ironed that morning, her hair in two neat braids. The bruise on her face had faded to a barely visible yellow tinge. Claire walked beside her daughter in the nicest clothes she owned, a simple black dress and cardigan she usually saved for funerals. Her face was pale but determined. The crowd parted automatically as the procession moved down the center aisle. Parents from Pinewood Elementary, regulars from the Highway Diner, people who had heard the stories and wanted to see if they were true. Marcus Garrett's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally a flash of something that might have been fear before his political training reasserted control. What is the meaning of this? Marcus's voice came out higher than he intended. Sheriff Barnes, remove these men from the building. They're disrupting. This is a public forum, Councilman, Sheriff Barnes said calmly, not moving from his position against the wall. These men are citizens of this county. They pay property taxes. They have every right to be here and speak during public comment. But they're criminals. Actually, Doc said, his voice carrying clearly in the acoustics of the old building. We're property owners, business operators, taxpayers, and American citizens exercising our First Amendment rights. Unless you'd like to violate those rights on camera, he gestured subtly to the 3 cameras recording the meeting for the town's live stream and official archives. Marcus gripped his gavel so hard his knuckles turned white. But he was trapped. Throwing them out now on camera after calling them criminals without evidence would be political suicide. Fine, he bit out. Public comment is open, but keep it brief. Hammer walked slowly to the public podium at the front of the room, his heavy footsteps echoing on the old wooden floor. He adjusted the microphone to his considerable height and looked directly at Marcus Garrett. Councilman Garrett, Hammer began, his deep voice amplified and controlled. You've spent the past year calling my brothers and me a menace to this community. You've said we're dangerous, criminal, that we don't belong in decent society. He paused, letting that hang in the air. You fired a hard-working single mother from her job to punish her for asking us for help. You're trying to seize our property, our home, to line your own pockets. And you did all of this while claiming to represent family values and civic duty. Hammer stepped aside, gesturing to Doc. But we're not here to argue about character. We're here to present facts. Doc approached the podium carrying his leather folder. He placed it down with deliberate care and opened it, revealing the documents inside. "My name is Nathan Cross," Doc said, his voice taking on the polished authority of a trial attorney. "I am legal counsel for the property owners being targeted by Resolution 404, and I'm here to submit into the public record a series of documents that I believe will be of great interest to this council and to the citizens of Ridgemont." Marcus leaned forward. "What documents?" Doc turned to address the crowd playing to the cameras like he'd done in dozens of courtrooms. "Banking records, councilman. Specifically the banking records of a shell corporation called Apex Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands. Over the past 8 months, exactly $1.2 million has been wired into this offshore account by Richard Copeland, the developer who stands to profit enormously if the property at 4747 County Line Road is seized through eminent domain." The crowd gasped. Murmurs of shock rippled through the room. Council members on either side of Marcus shifted in their seats, suddenly wanting to put distance between themselves and the councilman. Doc held up a piece of paper. "I also have the articles of incorporation for Apex Holdings. The sole beneficiary and signatory on that offshore account is Marcus J. Garrett, city councilman, sitting right there." He pointed directly at Marcus, who had gone completely pale. "You're not seizing this property to build a shopping center for the good of Ridgemont, councilman. You're doing it because you took a massive illegal bribe. That's called corruption, wire fraud, extortion, and it's a federal crime." The room erupted, citizens shouting questions, council members standing up demanding explanations. Reporters who had been covering the meeting out of boredom suddenly scrambling for their phones and cameras. "This is a lie," Marcus screamed, his composure shattering completely. He stood up so fast his chair toppled backward. "These are fabricated documents. They're criminals. They're framing me. You can't believe." "Actually, Councilman," Sheriff Barnes said, finally pushing off from the wall and walking down the center aisle, "we can believe them because Mr. Cross provided my office and the FBI field office in Phoenix with a full digital copy of these documents at 3 p.m. yesterday. The federal agents have had 24 hours to verify everything." Marcus froze, his mouth still open, the color draining from his face like someone had opened a tap. Barnes reached the front of the room, unclipping his handcuffs from his belt with a metallic click that seemed incredibly loud in the sudden silence. "And as of 1 hour ago, I received official authorization to execute a federal warrant for your arrest." "No," Marcus whispered. "No, this isn't, you can't." "Marcus Garrett," Sheriff Barnes said formally, "I'm placing you under arrest for wire fraud, accepting bribes as a public official, and conspiracy to commit extortion. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The rest of the Miranda warning was drowned out by the deafening roar of applause that erupted from the crowd. Not polite clapping, a genuine thunderous ovation. People were standing, cheering, some were crying, parents from Pinewood, waitresses from the Highway Diner, small business owners who had been crushed under Marcus Garrett's corrupt thumb for years, and finally were watching him fall. Sheriff Barnes walked Marcus down from the dais in handcuffs, the councilman's face a mask of shock and disbelief. As they passed Hammer, Marcus looked up at the massive biker. "You did this," Marcus hissed. "You destroyed me." "No," Hammer said quietly. "You destroyed yourself. We just turned on the lights so everyone could see it." As Sheriff Barnes escorted Marcus out the front door to a waiting patrol car, the crowd continued to cheer. Flash bulbs popped. Video cameras recorded every moment. The vice chair of the council, a woman named Sandra Morrison, who had always been too intimidated by Marcus to oppose him, shakily took over the meeting. I I move that Resolution 404 be immediately withdrawn and struck from the record, she said, her voice gaining strength. All in favor? Aye. The remaining 4 council members couldn't vote fast enough. Motion carries. The eviction notice against the property at 4747 County Line Road is hereby rescinded. More applause. Bear let out a whoop that could probably be heard 3 blocks away. Hammer didn't cheer. He simply turned and walked back to where Marin and Claire stood. He knelt down in front of the little girl who was staring at him with absolute wonder. You did it, Hammer, Marin whispered. You won. No, kiddo, Hammer said gently. We won. We protect our own. Remember, you're part of this now, part of us. Marin threw her arms around his neck, hugging him with all her strength. Over her shoulder, Hammer saw Claire watching them, tears streaming down her face. Their eyes met. Something passed between them, something neither of them was quite ready to name yet. But it was there. Recognition, gratitude, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something else. Doc approached, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. That went even better than I hoped. The press is going to crucify Garrett. FBI will probably add more charges once they dig deeper. He's looking at serious prison time. Good, Hammer said simply. He stood up, still holding Marin's hand. Now let's go home. As the Hells Angels filed out of the town hall, still in their suits, the crowd parted respectfully. Some people nodded in acknowledgement. A few even offered quiet words of thanks. Outside, the 32 men climbed into the various trucks and cars they'd driven, instead of their bikes, maintaining their respectable appearance until they were clear of the cameras. But once they were back at the clubhouse, the suits came off, immediately replaced by comfortable leather and denim. The celebration was loud and joyous, beer flowing freely, music playing, the stress of the past days finally releasing. Claire and Marin had been driven to the clubhouse by Doc, who'd insisted it wasn't safe for them to go home alone yet. Not until they were sure Marcus didn't have any loyalists who might try something stupid. Marin sat on a bar stool, spinning in circles, clutching a Shirley Temple. That wrench had made her completely delighted by everything around her. She'd never been inside the clubhouse before. It was like a whole secret world. Claire stood a little apart, still nervous despite everything. This was the inner sanctum of the Hells Angels, and she was just a waitress who didn't belong in this rough, masculine space. Hammer noticed her discomfort and approached with 2 beers, offering her one. I don't usually drink, Claire said automatically. Neither do I much anymore, Hammer replied. But I figured tonight might call for an exception. They clinked bottles and drank in companionable silence for a moment. What happens now? Claire asked. I mean, Marcus is arrested, but I still don't have a due. And you said yourself, desperate men do dangerous things. What if he... Claire, Hammer interrupted gently. We got that covered. He nodded to Doc, who approached with yet another folder. This man apparently had an infinite supply of folders. Mrs. Cole, Doc said formally, the club had a vote this afternoon before the town hall meeting. We'd like to make you a business proposal. Claire blinked. A business proposal? The Hells Angels don't have a legitimate front business in Ridgemont, Doc explained. We've been looking for one for a while, something legal, something that contributes to the community. Yesterday afternoon, we purchased the Highway Diner from Rosa, paid her a fair price in cash. She was ready to retire anyway. Claire's mouth fell open. You bought the diner? We did, Hammer confirmed. But none of us know the first thing about running a restaurant. Ordering inventory, managing staff, keeping the health inspector happy. We just know how to eat. Doc slid a contract across the bar. We'd like to offer you the position of general manager. You'd run the entire operation. Salary is double what you were making in tips. full health benefits for you and Marin, and 20% of the net profit at the end of each year. The job is yours if you want it, Hammer added. No strings, no obligations beyond doing the work. We trust you. Claire stared at the contract, her hands shaking so badly she had to set her beer down. You're giving me a job after everything. We're offering you a shock you earned, Doc corrected. You're a good worker, good with people, good with numbers from what Rosa told us. You're exactly who we need. But why? Why would you do this for me? Hammer looked over at Marin, who was now being shown a vintage motorcycle in the garage by Bear. Her face lit up with pure joy. Because your daughter asked for help, Hammer said simply, and we don't leave our people behind. Claire picked up the pen with trembling hands. She read through the contract quickly, her eyes widening at the salary figure, at the benefits package, at the profit-sharing arrangement. It was more than generous. It was life-changing. She signed her name on the bottom line, the ink smearing slightly from the tears that had started falling again. The celebration continued late into the night, but eventually Claire and Marin needed to get home. Doc drove them in his truck, Hammer riding along to make sure they got safely inside. As Claire tucked Marin into bed that night, the little girl looked up at her mother with sleepy eyes. Mama, is this real? Is this really happening? Yes, baby, Claire whispered, brushing hair back from Marin's forehead. It's real. We have a family now, don't we? Claire felt her throat tighten with emotion. Yes, sweetheart, I think we do. Marin smiled, clutching her two talismans like always. Her father's dog tag, Hammer's winged wheel pin. Both symbols of fathers, one lost, one found. She fell asleep holding them both, finally truly safe. In the weeks that followed, Ridgemont slowly transformed. Marcus Garrett's arrest made regional news, then national news. The FBI investigation uncovered not just the Copeland bribery, but years of other corruption. Property deals, kickbacks, voter intimidation. By the time they were done, Marcus was facing 47 counts across multiple jurisdictions. Richard Copeland was arrested trying to flee the country, caught at a private airfield in Miami. The tip had come from an anonymous phone call placed from a payphone near the Hells Angels clubhouse. No one could prove who made the call, but everyone had their suspicions. The Highway Diner reopened under new management 3 weeks later. Claire had the place deep cleaned, updated the menu, hired back the staff who'd been let go, and started turning a profit within the first month. The bikers became regular fixtures, but so did families who appreciated the improved food and the welcoming atmosphere. Someone suggested renaming it. Claire thought about it for a long time, then had a new sign made, the Winged Wheel Diner, a tribute to the men who had saved her and her daughter. The sign went up on a bright Saturday morning, beautiful custom ironwork that caught the sunlight and gleamed. When Hammer saw it for the first time riding past on his way to the clubhouse, he pulled over and just stared at it for a full minute. Then he went inside, ordered coffee, and left a $100 tip. At Pinewood Elementary, things changed too. Dylan Garrett returned to school a week after his father's arrest, but the cocky bully was gone. In his place was a quiet, subdued boy who ate lunch alone and kept his head down. His two former friends had abandoned him the moment Marcus was arrested, sensing the shift in power. Dylan, who had spent years dishing out cruelty, now found himself on the receiving end. One day, an 8th grader knocked Dylan's lunch tray to the floor, mocking him about his father being in jail. Dylan sat there staring at the spilled food, bracing himself for more abuse, for the kicks and punches he'd given out so freely to others. A small hand reached down and picked up an apple that had rolled away, placing it gently on the table. Dylan looked up to find Marin Cole standing there. Her bruise was completely gone now, her face healthy and glowing. She looked different, stronger. more confident. "It's hard when your dad's gone," Marin said quietly, sitting down across from him without asking permission. "I know." Dylan stared at her, this girl he'd tormented for months, offering him kindness when he deserved none. His throat felt tight. He wanted to say something cruel, something cutting to push her away before she could see how much it hurt. But the words wouldn't come. "Why?" he managed to ask, his voice cracking. Marin shrugged, pulling out her own lunch. "Because Hammer taught me that being strong isn't about hurting people. It's about protecting them, even when they don't deserve it." She unwrapped her sandwich and took a bite, as if sitting with Dylan Garrett was the most natural thing in the world. Dylan looked down at his ruined lunch, then at the apple Marin had retrieved. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered, so quietly he wasn't sure she'd heard. But Marin nodded, acknowledging it. "I know." They ate in silence after that. It wasn't comfortable exactly. Too much history, too much pain. But it wasn't hostile either. It was the beginning of something. Maybe not friendship, but understanding. A truce. Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened. Marin didn't abandon Dylan. She sat with him at lunch most days, not saying much, just being present. And slowly other kids noticed. If Marin Cole, who had every reason to hate Dylan Garrett, could show him kindness, maybe he wasn't completely irredeemable. A few other outcasts started sitting at their table, the quiet kids, the ones who'd been bullied before. They formed an unlikely group bonded by their shared understanding of what it felt like to be on the outside. Dylan never became popular. He'd burned too many bridges for that, but he stopped being cruel. He started doing his homework. He even joined the school's peer mediation program, using his experience as a former bully to help other kids resolve conflicts. It was Marin who nominated him for it. When the teacher asked why, Marin had simply said, "Because everyone deserves a second chance, even people who've done bad things." Hammer, when he heard about this months later, smiled with fierce pride. That was his kid, teaching the world how to be better one lunch table at a time. 14 months after that day at the diner, when a desperate girl asked a stranger for help, the world looked completely different. The Highway Diner was the most popular restaurant in Ridgemont. On any given afternoon, the parking lot was a democratic mix of vehicles, minivans with soccer mom stickers, work trucks with toolboxes, pristine SUVs, and a dozen Harley-Davidsons that gleamed in the Arizona sun. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. Claire had replaced the old flickering fluorescent lights with softer fixtures. The cracked vinyl booths had been reupholstered. The menu had been expanded with homemade specials that actually tasted good. But the biggest change was Claire herself. The exhausted, haunted woman who used to shuffle between tables was gone. In her place was someone confident, capable, and genuinely happy. She had gained healthy weight, her face had color, and when she smiled at customers, it reached her eyes. She managed a staff of 6, now running the operation with efficiency and kindness. The diner was profitable, consistently so, and her 20% share meant she and Marin had moved into a real apartment. 2 bedrooms, working plumbing, in a neighborhood where Marin could play outside without Claire worrying. The door chimed, and a familiar rumble vibrated through the floor. Hammer walked in, flanked by Reaper and Bear. Their leather vests were dusty from a long ride, their faces weathered by sun and wind. Before they even reached their usual booth, Claire had 3 mugs of black coffee sliding across the counter the way they liked it, strong enough to strip paint. "Afternoon, boss," Claire teased, the old joke comfortable and warm between them now. "Keep calling me boss, and I'm gonna start actually checking those inventory reports," Hammer grumbled, but he was smiling as he took a long drink of the scalding coffee. "Where's Marin?" he asked, looking around. Out back, Claire said, rolling her eyes with unmistakable affection. Where else would she be? Hammer set down his mug and pushed off the counter, walking through the kitchen toward the heavy steel back door. The cooks waved at him as he passed. He knew all their names now, knew their kids' names, had helped two of them fix their cars when money was tight. He stepped out into the afternoon heat. The property behind the diner extended for several acres, ending at a thick tree line of desert scrub and mesquite. 6 months ago, the club had pooled money and brought in earth-moving equipment to carve out a proper dirt track. What had been empty desert was now a winding course of berms, jumps, straightaways, and tight corners. A miniature motocross track built to scale for smaller bikes and younger riders. The high-pitched, angry whine of a two-stroke engine echoed across the property. Coming around the final berm, kicking up a massive rooster tail of brown dirt, was a custom-built matte black Honda 85 cubic centimeter dirt bike. The suspension compressed and extended as the rider navigated the terrain, leaning into turns with confidence that came from countless hours of practice. The rider hit the final tabletop jump at full throttle. The bike launched into the air, catching at least 3 feet of elevation, hanging suspended for a perfect moment before gravity reasserted itself. The landing was smooth, controlled, the suspension absorbing the impact like it was designed to do. The rider slid the bike to a dramatic stop right in front of Hammer, throwing up a final spray of dirt, and killed the engine. The sudden silence was almost jarring after the mechanical scream. She pulled off her helmet, revealing a mop of dirty blonde hair plastered to her head with sweat. Her face was flushed from exertion and heat, her eyes bright with adrenaline and joy. Marin Cole, 10 years old now, grinned up at Hammer. Her face was completely free of bruises, had been for over a year. Her cheeks had filled out with regular meals and proper nutrition. She looked healthy, strong, happy. "Did you see that, Hammer?" Marin shouted, breathless. "I cleared the whole tabletop. Must have been 3 feet of air." "Saw it, kid." Hammer laughed, his deep voice filled with unmistakable pride. He walked over and automatically checked the tension on the bike's drive chain, an old habit he'd developed, teaching her to maintain her equipment, not just ride it. "You're getting heavy on the throttle, though," he said, adjusting his inspection. "Keep riding like that, and I'm going to have to enter you in the amateur qualifiers at the state championship next month." Marin's eyes went huge. "Really, you think I'm ready?" "I think you've been ready for 3 months. Just been waiting for you to believe it." Marin squealed and threw her arms around Hammer's waist, still sitting on the bike, hugging him fiercely. Hammer rested one massive hand on the back of her helmet, careful and gentle, despite his strength. Over the past 18 months, the bond between them had grown into something profound and unbreakable. He had taught her how to ride, how to change a tire, how to throw a proper left hook and when it was appropriate to use it, how to stand up straight and look people in the eye, how to be brave even when you're scared. And she had taught him something in return, something he hadn't known he'd forgotten how to do. She had taught him how to be soft again, how to care without apology, how to be a father. The sound of more motorcycles approaching made them both look up. Reaper and Bear were coming around the side of the diner, followed by 3 pickup trucks. "Birthday delivery," Bear called out, his massive grin visible even from a distance. The trucks pulled up and bikers started unloading supplies. A small chocolate cake with 10 candles. Balloons, presents wrapped in newspaper comics because none of them knew how to wrap properly and had decided to lean into it. "Happy birthday, little sister," Reaper called out, producing the cake from a box with the care of someone handling a bomb. Marin ran over still in her dirt bike gear and blew out all 10 candles in one breath. The assembled bikers, a mixture of the roughest men in Arizona, cheered like she'd just won the Super Bowl. Claire appeared in the back doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, tears already streaming down her face. Happy tears, grateful tears. The kind of tears that came from watching your child be surrounded by people who loved her. Doc emerged behind Claire, putting a gentle hand on her shoulder. Over the past year, Doc had become a regular presence in Claire's life, helping with legal paperwork for the diner, offering advice, staying for coffee that turned into dinner, dinners that turned into long conversations. Nothing official, not yet, but there was something there, something growing. Hammer watched them from across the yard and smiled. Good. Claire deserved happiness, deserved someone who would treat her right. Present time, Wrench announced, carrying a box that was clearly homemade, covered in motorcycle stickers. Marin tore into the presents with the enthusiasm of a kid who'd never had a real birthday party before. Because she hadn't. Not like this. There were motorcycle boots in her size from Reaper, a custom leather jacket kid size from Bear, a first aid kit for riders from Chain because safety mattered, a stack of books about famous motorcycle racers from Doc because education mattered too. And then Hammer approached with a small box wrapped in simple brown paper. This one's from me, kiddo. Marin opened it carefully, somehow knowing this one was different. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a heavy silver chain with a dog tag attached. But this wasn't her father's old military tag. This was new. One side was engraved with the winged death's head of the Hells Angels. The other side read, Marin Cole, family. Marin looked up at Hammer, her eyes filling with tears. Not sad tears, the overwhelming kind that came from feeling too much happiness to contain. You're not just honorary anymore, Hammer said softly, kneeling down so they were eye level. You're family, real family, the kind that doesn't leave. Marin threw herself at him, wrapping her arms around his neck, and Hammer caught her easily, holding her tight. Thank you, Daddy, she whispered into his shoulder. Hammer's eyes stung. He blinked rapidly, but a few tears escaped anyway, running down into his gray beard. He didn't care who saw. Any time, daughter, he whispered back. Any time. Claire watched from the doorway, Doc's arm around her shoulders now, and she couldn't stop crying. Her daughter had a father, a real one, not by blood but by choice, the strongest kind. The party continued for another hour. Cake was eaten, which meant cake was also thrown by the younger bikers who still had a sense of humor about food fights. Marin demonstrated her riding skills for everyone, showing off the tricks she'd learned. As the sun started to set, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple, people started to drift away. The bikers mounted their ride's engines, rumbling to life, heading back to the clubhouse. Doc kissed Claire on the cheek, gentle and respectful, before climbing into his truck. Claire touched her face where his lips had been and smiled. Hammer was the last to leave. He stood by his bike, looking at the diner, at Claire and Marin standing together in the doorway, waving goodbye. This wasn't the life he'd planned. 40 years ago, when he'd run from that trailer park in Nevada with his mother's blood on his hands, he'd never imagined this. A family, a purpose beyond survival. He'd thought he was saving Marin that day in the parking lot, but maybe she'd saved him too. Hammer raised one hand in farewell, kick-started his Harley, and rode off into the desert sunset, the engine's roar echoing off the distant mountains. Years later, Marin would earn her prospect patch, at 16 the youngest anyone had ever been considered. At 18, after proving herself on long rides and in the kind of situations that tested character, she would become a full patch member. The first woman to ever wear the death's head for the Arizona charter. But that was still years away. Tonight she was just a 10-year-old girl standing with her mother wearing a dog tag that said she belonged to someone. She pulled out her father's old tag too, the one from Daniel Cole. She held them both, one in each hand. Two fathers, one who had left, one who had stayed. She didn't hate the father who had left anymore. She understood now that people were complicated, that sometimes people ran because they were broken, not because you were unlovable. But she didn't need him anymore either. She had Hammer. She had the club. She had her mother safe and happy and strong. She had a family. Come on, baby, Claire said, putting her arm around Marin's shoulders. Let's go home. Okay, Mama. They walked back inside together, turning off the lights one by one, leaving the desert to its nighttime quiet. The story of Marin Cole and the Hells Angels would become legend in Ridgemont. People would tell it for decades, embellishing it, changing details, making it bigger and more dramatic with each retelling. But the truth was simple and perfect on its own. A desperate child had asked for help, and the right people had answered. All 32 of them, on motorcycles that shook the earth, ready to change the world for one little girl who just needed someone to stand up and say, I'll be your father, I'll keep you safe, I'll teach you to be strong. And they did, and she was. The end.